My name is Christopher, and I'm a civil engineer. Recently, my team and I went through an experience that still gives me shivers just thinking about it. We were hired to renovate an abandoned hospital, and, by a twist of fate, we ended up spending the night there. I never thought a place could have such an impact on me. Let me tell you how it all unfolded. It all started when we landed a big contract to renovate an old hospital on the outskirts of town. It was a nearly 50-year-old building, which had seen better days. The structure was quite dilapidated, but it still had a certain vintage charm that made us wonder how it must have been in its heyday. The journey to the site was long and tiring. We arrived late at night, later than we had anticipated. We were all exhausted, and since the nearest city was an hour away, we decided it would be best to spend the night at the hospital itself. After all, we were set to begin work bright and early the next day, so it made sense to stay put. As we arrived, we realized that the place was even gloomier than we had imagined. The rusty iron gate creaked ominously as we opened it. The windows were shattered, and the main entrance was covered in dust and cobwebs. It seemed like nobody had set foot there in years. We entered the hospital and decided to explore a bit before settling in. The lighting was minimal, so we used flashlights to find our way around. Every step echoed in the empty corridors, creating an even tenser atmosphere. We passed through several rooms, all abandoned, with old furniture and outdated medical equipment scattered everywhere. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of paint and wallpaper from decades past. In some spots, dampness had created dark stains resembling strange shapes. As we walked through the corridors, I couldn't help but think about the people who had passed through there. Patients, doctors, nurses. They all had their stories, their pains, and their fears. And now, here we were, occupying that space laden with memories. It made me reflect on how a place can hold so many emotions. We decided it would be best to settle in a larger room, which must have once been a waiting area or perhaps a small ward. We laid out our sleeping bags on the floor, which was covered in dust and bits of plaster fallen from the ceiling. The windows in this room were so dirty that they barely let in the moonlight, creating an even more claustrophobic atmosphere. We tried to prepare ourselves for a peaceful night, but I couldn't relax. The silence was disturbing, interrupted only by the occasional sound of a dripping faucet or the wind blowing through the broken windows. After lying down in my sleeping bag, I began to feel a growing restlessness. The silence, once merely uncomfortable, became oppressive. Every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind whistled through the cracks in the broken windows, creating an almost human-like lament. The drips falling from somewhere in the ceiling produced a rhythmic sound, reminiscent of old clocks ticking away the time that seemed to drag on. The air was cold and damp, and the feeling of being surrounded by walls that had witnessed so much suffering was overwhelming. My thoughts kept returning to the stories the former hospital employee had told us. I could almost feel the presence of the former patients, their pains and fears lingering in the environment. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move in the dim light, and I found myself staring at the doors, hoping not to see something I didn't want to. My colleagues didn't seem to be sleeping either. Occasionally, I would hear one of them shifting or sighing, clearly sharing in my discomfort. My heart raced, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What if something really happens? The idea that we were in a place where so many lives were lost. The hospital had been founded in the 1970s, at the height of an epidemic of an unknown disease that swept through the region. It was hastily built to meet the growing demand for patients, many of whom did not survive. For decades, the hospital was a symbol of both hope and despair, saving lives while witnessing countless losses. Stories of emergency surgeries, difficult births, and sudden deaths were plentiful. We heard reports that during the epidemic, the hospital was so overwhelmed that the bodies of the deceased were stored in an improvised room in the basement until they could be removed. I learned of these stories from a former hospital employee, who is now our contact for the renovation. He spoke of the psychiatric ward, where patients with severe mental illnesses were kept in conditions that today would be considered inhumane. Tales of abuse, neglect, and despair were common. Many patients never left the hospital, passing away in their beds, their names forgotten by time. Furthermore, there was the pediatric ward, which, according to reports, was a place of profound sadness. Many gravely ill children spent their last days there, and the walls seemed to still echo with the sound of their voices. Our contact told us about a specific ward where nurses would place toys on the empty beds in an attempt to bring some joy to such a sorrowful place. These details only made the experience of spending the night there even more disturbing. Sleep eluded me, and my thoughts continued to bother me. Was it really safe to spend the night there? What if something happened? I tried to push these thoughts aside, but it was impossible to ignore the growing discomfort. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, as if something was moving in the corridor. I rose slowly, trying not to wake my colleagues, and went to investigate. Every step I took echoed through the dark corridors, creating an almost ghostly sound. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, its shadows dancing sinisterly in the dim light of my flashlight. The air was cold, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end, as if the hospital itself were whispering ancient and painful secrets. As I advanced, my senses were on high alert. The sound I was following was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It sounded like a gentle scratching, a whisper that mingled with the wind entering through the broken windows. As I approached, I realized it was coming from one of the rooms we had not yet explored. A growing sense of dread washed over me, but curiosity and the need to understand what was happening drove me forward. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. I took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, pushed the door open, which creaked eerily. The room was shrouded in almost total darkness, only partially illuminated by the faint glow of the moon seeping through the dusty windows. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There was a gurney in the middle of the room, with dried bloodstains around it. It wasn't a lot of blood, but enough to cause great discomfort. The dark stains starkly contrasted with the yellowed white of the old gurney, telling a story of pain and suffering that I could almost feel in the air. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. My brain refused to process the scene in front of me. The silence in the room was overwhelming, filled only by the sound of my rapid, uncontrolled breathing. I could smell the metallic scent of old blood, mixed with the mustiness and decay of the hospital. The sight of that dried blood conjured disturbing images in my mind, of patient suffering, of doctors desperately fighting to save lives amidst chaos. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the light across the rest of the room. I saw abandoned medical equipment, rusted and forgotten by time. A wheelchair lay overturned in the corner, its arms outstretched as if pleading for help. There was a heavy, almost palpable atmosphere, as if the walls were infused with the pain and despair of so many past lives. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Finally, I managed to move, and with faltering steps, I retreated to the corridor. I closed the door slowly, as if afraid that any noise could awaken something that should remain dormant. I returned to where my colleagues were without saying a word, but the terror I felt in that room never left me. Finally, the sun began to rise, painting the sky a soft orange and dissipating the shadows that seemed to have taken root in the hospital. With the daylight came a deep sense of relief, as if an invisible weight were slowly lifted from our shoulders. The dawn brought the promise of safety and normalcy, something that seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. We left the hospital in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The walk to the car was quick, but each step seemed to take us further away from that terrifying night. The road to the nearest town was almost deserted, and the journey was marked by contemplative silence, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the asphalt and the heavy breathing of my colleagues. Arriving in town, we found a small hotel where we could finally rest and try to make sense of what had happened. Sitting in the hotel's small cafe, we shared our experiences and feelings. Each account added a layer of understanding, but also of mystery, to that night in the hospital. The tension left us marked in a way we could never have predicted. As we listened to each other, I realized that this experience had transformed us. The abandoned hospital was no longer just a dilapidated building. It was a place imbued with stories and emotions that deeply affected us. From that day on, I never looked at an abandoned hospital in the same way. The memory of that night would haunt my thoughts, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the invisible scars that places like that can leave. Even in the light of day, the emotional impact was undeniable. There was something ineffable about the experience, a sense that we had glimpsed a dark part of human history that typically remains hidden. We felt a mixture of respect and awe for the place, aware that for one night, we had touched the fabric of the past in a deeply personal and unsettling way. That place was marked by pain and suffering, and I learned that sometimes, it's better not to challenge the unknown. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember my story and think twice before spending the night in a place like that. It may be an experience you'll never forget.